They used to say the church is the only place that shoots its wounded. And let me tell you, anybody who's in deconstruction now, has been, or will understand exactly what that means. Today's webinar is the best way that I can think of to put out to you that my voice has not changed. I am the same, saying the same thing now I said 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and 30 years ago when it comes to talking to people instead of about them and assuming good intent. But the opening story in this little clip made me laugh because it was about an alcoholic who had been found out by the church. He happened to be the pastor of a megachurch, and history rhymes. We had an historian on this week who talked about things that AI doesn't want talked about. We got an explicit rating for the first time ever. So then my brain says, well, if they're going to say I'm explicit, I guess I can be explicit. I did a lot of work in churches in Las Vegas as a parachurch agency, going in for the hard cases that they didn't want to handle. And sometimes the leader of that group would say, we don't want to scare up more rabbits than we can shoot, so don't talk about that here. Particularly when we started talking about sexual addiction, the church's best kept secret. Haven't talked about that stuff in a long time. This video is the moment in time when we just laid it all out there so people could see it's a systems issue. It's not a person. It's not a problem. It is a system. When this pastor was exposed, first they did all the things they did to keep it quiet. They put all the enablers around him to keep him from getting caught. When finally it progressed to the point that he wanted to get caught or just couldn't help himself. When it became public, then they all were horrified at the extent to which it had gotten. But they all had a hand in the pie and wanted him to keep doing it and fill their pockets as long as he did. So they were ready to dispose of him because he was just a useful tool to the system that ran the organization. Sound familiar? History rhymes, and it's rhyming again now. So listen to this and see if you can draw any connections or conclusions, and then share it with us in the comments. And if you find that you want to have a deeper discussion, come on over to the Cove at One Voice Evolving and come into the circle where we can heal and help. What we can't do is let you grab a towel and think that it's a spa and sunbathing event, because that is not what the Cove is for. It is for wounded warriors to regroup, reclaim, recover, and rehab so they can get back to the life of their dreams. Hope to see you there.
Few weeks ago, there was a church event that took place that splashed all over my Facebook page, and I couldn't ignore it. And it had to do with church doctrine, and it had to do with a drinking problem, and what I saw was the amount of fallout from the people who were part of that system when it all started to take shape. There was an awful lot of pain, and I just felt like I couldn't sit on the sidelines and watch people hurt and bleed when I knew that we had the tools and the experience to be able to give them a hand up or to teach them how to apply the bandage so they could help each other. And so what we're trying to do today, and there's no charge, no fees, no big sales pitch at the end, is just to lend a hand to what I call walking wounded. And those are the ones that are in the midst of some kind of either a church abuse or a church split or just some toxic, feels icky situation that they don't quite know what to do with. And tonight we'll cover what is spiritual abuse, what it isn't, why it affects us so much, and give you some concrete ways to begin to walk out of that if it's a dark place for you. Some people say that the church is the only organization that shoots its wounded. And if you're at this seminar, you have been shot at, or you know somebody who has. And maybe you've been grazed and you've got a flesh wound, or maybe it hit a vital organ and you've been in the hospital for a while and you're thinking about getting back on the field or getting back into the army and going back into the church. It might be that what you have is a mortal wound and you're never going to darken the doors of a church again. The worst thing that happens for people who go to the church for healing and for spiritual growth is when they get shot by friendly fire. Because one of the things that we know in the Christian walk is that we need community and we need fellowship, but we need it to be a safe place. When you can't find a safe place, then either trying to find it outside of the church, or you try to make it inside of the church, or you make it within yourself. And you might try multiple paths. I didn't come to Jesus until I was like 27, and I didn't know all the rules, and so I kept bumping over those lines, not knowing I wasn't supposed to bump over that line. Everybody who's here would have a church horror story, or know somebody who does. Anybody who doesn't have that or doesn't want to own that is not going to be drawn to a title like Toxic Faith when the church wounds its own. Because we're either here to try to get some information so we can help somebody who's wounded, or we're wounded or pissed off and don't know what else to do with it. So I just took some quotes from things that I had picked up along the way. And some of this is from like this one pastor who was encouraged from the board of directors, but without warning was terminated. One left an abusive church, but it distorted their view of God. And so they're out there flailing, distant, disconnected from God. This is the throw the baby out with the bathwater syndrome. If your pastor is a micromanager, that is a symptom of spiritual abuse. He comes down hard on people who don't fall in line. And that causes people to either bail or more than likely be still, be quiet, and don't make waves, right? Those are the we for and no more kind of churches oftentimes. This one on the top left, it's taken literally 15 years to figure out what happened, and we felt so guilty for even questioning. In those kind of churches, when you leave the church, you feel like you're leaving God, and oftentimes those are the ones who then will separate from you. You can't, the people who are still in the church can't talk to you because you left and you're not of them anymore, right? So everybody's got war stories, and one of the things that's important to do at some point, if you're going to move past your war story, is to be able to talk about it and tell it. And by the time you've gotten 25 years into the process, you might have more than one, right? It was a little difficult to pick a war story when I didn't know the rules, and I had gone into this church, and the first week I went there, the pastor was preaching about Rafa 12-step, which was a Christian 12-step. And I was in a 12-step program. I had become a Christian. A year later, I went into a 12-step program for recovery. I didn't know Christians weren't supposed to do that. And then as I started going around to find a church after that, they didn't want me to do anything except like wash towels or something, because they were afraid I was going to, talk to somebody and poison their thinking because it was 12-step. That was before Celebrate Recovery. I went to this little church, and the pastor was preaching about Rafa 12-step, and that was amazing. And I was really drawn, and he'd been praying for something that would spark this little church. It was only about probably 60 or 70 people. And so I started doing groups and trainings and seminars and started to attract the unchurched and the unlovely, because that's what happens when you share the message of Jesus Christ. And it is, come who you are heavy laden and I'll give you rest. You don't have to perform to be accepted. You can come exactly the way you are, and we love and we embrace you. But what I noticed was there started to be a clique on that side of the church of the people who'd been there from the beginning. And then the group on this side of the church who were sitting over around me who weren't all together yet. You know, they didn't have they weren't wearing the right clothes, and they didn't have the right job, and they weren't tithing the right way. And the longer that went on, the more noticeable you started to be able to feel the tension on a Sunday morning. And so at a point in time, I went to a elders meeting on a Sunday because we had grown to the point where every time I did a class, there was a waiting list twice as big for the next class. So then I was doing them back to back. And then there was a waiting list for 4 times that many. And so we needed to start training facilitators. It was growing, and that meant the church was growing, but they weren't receptive to that kind of growth. And I didn't know anything about the business of church back then. I didn't know it was about the tithe and the income and the, you know, the numbers, and I don't know what all it was about. And so I went to the elders meeting and I said, you know, I don't need your money. I need your prayer support, but I really don't need anything from you except to know that you are behind this effort to reach the wounded. And they went around the room and individually voted, and it was unanimous that we think that what you're doing is God, and we think you should keep doing it over there, outside of our church. We don't want it in our church, over there. And I had, you know, 60 people on a waiting list who needed classes to start like in 2 weeks. So boy, we scrambled and started a parachurch agency and, you know, got all kind of stuff in place so that we could continue to minister that way. That was my my one and only encounter in church business. After that, when I've gone to church, I sit in the back row. I don't get involved in the politics of the church ever, because that is my self-care. And what I do as a child of God, and somebody who bridges the gap between the unchurched and a God they can trust. If you've been wounded by the church, or you're damaged goods, or you're a pastor who's listening in to find out how not to hurt people, the first rule is don't panic. Don't feed the fears. Don't make it worse than it is. Don't try to pray it away, because honestly, that hardly ever works either, even though you'll be encouraged to. So I just want to dig into some definitions to get right into the meat of this. Spiritual abuse. Jeff Van Vonderen wrote a book called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. Great book. If you're a reader, I highly recommend it. Another good one is Toxic Faith by Steve Arterburn. This one is the mistreatment of a person who is in need of help, support, or greater spiritual empowerment, with the result of weakening, undermining, or decreasing that person's spiritual empowerment. That is the definition of spiritual abuse. That's a lot of words. What that means is that anybody in spiritual authority who, instead of helping you get stronger when you're in need, makes you feel ashamed of your need, that's spiritual abuse. It could be a church person. It could be a 12-step sponsor. It could even be a parent. It could be anybody who is in a position of spiritual authority, or who you go to who is a God representative to you, and you go to with your problem. Have you ever had your gone to somebody in confidence and had it hit the prayer chain? That was my favorite. That was always my favorite. That was the Christian way to gossip without calling it that.
That's right.
Oh, here, I'll put it on the prayer chain, and pretty soon 22 people know what your issue is, and nobody broke a rule.
That's right.
So spiritual abuse has 4 levels. Now, to be clear, most American churches don't ever get to level 4. Very few even get to level 3. Most of them run somewhere between moderately dysfunctional and moderately healthy. And you'll see on a sliding scale in a few minutes what that looks like. So the level 1 is there's a secret. Now, just like any family system, churches are just like a family, and I use family systems a lot in other trainings I do, because everybody has a role in the system, and as long as everybody plays the role to support the system, life is wonderful. And the children are there to meet the needs of the family. Parishioners are there to meet the needs of the church. Just ask them by how many hours they're putting in over their 40-hour work week in volunteer work, right?
That's right. That's right.
And so in a family, there are not ever any secrets. There are only things not talked about. And so level 1, there's a secret. It could be a financial secret. If you don't know how much the pastor gets paid because their books aren't open, if you can't go to their annual financial meetings, if the pastor disappears for 5 hours at a time and the only people who know where he might be aren't telling, and usually that's the church secretary because she knows everything.
Right.
And it's her job not to tell. So if there's a secret. So that's level 1. There's something we don't want to get out. We don't talk about what happens inside the church, outside the church. The level 2, it escalates to level 2 when you start to ask about the secret and you get in trouble for asking. When you bring attention to it, to the fact that that you've tried to, they're just trying to ask a simple question about finances, and instead of them answering your question, they question your spirituality for even needing to know. Where's your faith? That would be a level 2. A level 3 is condemnation, and that's where if you have an abusive system, you're going to have people who are invested in keeping it the way it is. And if you start to ask too many questions or you start to make too many waves, then they need to silence you before too many people hear it or before you cause too much stir. And that's when you start hitting the prayer chains, or that's when they start talking about you instead of to you.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, that's when there are meetings held and you're not invited, but you are a topic of conversation. When they start painting you green as something really wrong, they can really build a case if they're trying to get rid of somebody. And if it's a very authoritarian structure, they need to get rid of naysayers, people who won't conform, quickly. Quicker they can get them out of there, the better. Right. And level 4 then is when it escalates to a true cult situation where they're isolating from family, there is continued violence. And you would think that that's unheard of because, oh my gosh, I was talking about this stuff 20 years ago, and yet this week on Facebook, what did you send me? Something from the South Carolina newspaper about a church, and 43 people left the church in February 27th, it was, over level 4 violence in a non-denominational, I think it was non-denominational little church. It's happening, and people who think it isn't, head in the sand. What can I say? Anybody who's going to be drawn to this kind of webinar are going to be coming from all over the board, and I want to make sure that we cover a little of everything. So that's what abuse is. It's toxic, right? It's going to kill you. Right. Sometimes poison kills you slowly. Sometimes you bleed out from it. Yeah. Here's what it isn't, because just because a church does something you don't agree with doesn't make it abusive, right? Decision can be made by those in authority that disagree with your opinion, and unless they turn that into a personal attack, your opinion, oh, that's a stupid opinion, or they use that to say you are less Christian or less spiritual because of your opinion, it's not abuse to be confronted with your sin or even with honest mistakes, unless they use that confrontation to shame or discredit you, rather than heal you, save you, restore you, which is the work of Jesus, right? Established a church to be his hospital. That's the way I view it. And people come to the hospital so that they don't die out there. And we bandage them up in churches. We bandage them up and make them look good, but they might have a life-threatening artery cut, and we put a Band-Aid on it. And when they start to seep underneath that, then we blame them because they didn't stop bleeding. Abuse is not getting asked to step down from a position in church. That's not abuse, unless you get abandoned out there and you're not offered a restoration plan. Because the design is never to leave them. You know, when in the Bible that I read, when Jesus was, he never got angry with the sheep, never blamed the sheep. When a sheep got lost, it was never the sheep's fault for getting lost. Sheep wanders off into sin, not the sheep's fault. Where was the shepherd? If somebody is asked to step down from a position, then those who are doing the asking take that shepherding responsibility. I've worked with pastors who've gone down that road, and I think I've seen them offered what the church calls a restoration plan. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, right? Here's the 3 dysfunctional family rules. And you can stay in the flock. Don't be authentic and don't tell the truth. And don't talk about this restoration plan to anybody outside of the room. Right, gag order. Abuse is not disagreeing on doctrine or issues, even in public. You can disagree on Facebook all you want. They can disagree with you. That's not abuse, unless it turns into personal attack. And it's not abusive to hold certain standards of group conduct, which means you can not smoke. The group conduct can be, we don't smoke, we don't dance, we don't, we don't cook on Sundays, we don't anything. And that's fine, because every family has its own standards. Every church family has its own standards. It's not abusive unless they put other people down who don't hold those same convictions. When you have a church who's saying, we're the right ones, we're the only right ones, and those Christians are wrong because they don't do this, and those ones are wrong because they do that. When they start pointing and judging brothers in Christ, then that becomes abusive. That'd be a red flag. ACA is short for Adult Children of Alcoholics. Now, in family systems theory, it is estimated that 96% of American families are dysfunctional in some way. Now, dysfunction runs on a scale from 0 to 100, and that means that 96% of our families have some level, just kind of like our churches, level 1, 2, 3, 4, right, of dysfunction. If you're from an alcoholic home, and 25% of people were raised with an alcoholic, so you know, 25% of the people, then you're probably on the higher end of dysfunction, because the 3 operating rules in a dysfunctional family are don't talk about what's real here, don't trust anybody outside of the family unit, and don't feel. You're not allowed to, usually the only person allowed to feel angry is the alcoholic or the addict. Everybody else is walking on eggshells. It's the elephant in the living room story. You know, everybody's walking around the elephant in the living room, trying not to upset it, pretending it's not really making the mess it's making. Don't poke the bear. Okay? So from those family systems, now 25% of those come from alcoholic. Another 25% of people come from families where one or more parents were workaholics. So they were gone a lot. And some of that same dysfunction still applies. So at some point, you may have some of that. But they did a study and they said, okay, what happens with people who were raised with these dysfunctional family rules and people who weren't? And here's what they found. People who are able to experience God's love and forgiveness. I call these normals, and then I call people like me. Normal people, just about 5% of the population, have trouble experiencing God's love and forgiveness. So that means 95% of the normies have no problem with that. So they go to church and they get it. Almost half of us who were raised in dysfunctional families don't get it, because our life experience, our hard wiring before we were 6 years old. Everything about it says danger. The world is not a safe place. So we go into a church and we have to work. Think about it like being spiritual dyslexia. I have to work way harder to read that Bible and believe it's the infallible Word of God than maybe the person right next to me. And we could have been raised in the same neighborhood, but different family systems. So trusting God's will, same thing. Trust is a big issue for anybody who was ever sexually molested, which is 1 out of 3 women and 1 out of 5 men. For anybody who was raised with an alcoholic, addicted, or mentally ill parent or caregiver. For anybody who has experienced the kind of trauma that would trigger PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Trusting God's will, huge. So 12% of the average public, 54% of adult children of alcoholics. Now, let's say we have a church that is reaching out to the wounded, drinkers or pornography or compulsive gamblers, whatever it is. We bring those in. It's going to take a whole different approach, a whole different timeline, and a whole different preaching style for them to feel safe and comfortable, believing the Bible's promises. Well, if you've had promises broken in your life over and over and over, trust is tough. Believing promises is tough. 5% of the general population, 43% of adult children of alcoholics have trouble believing that. And this one was really good, forgiving others. And this is what I saw a lot on Facebook as I've watched some of these issues explode in the last few weeks. People are feeling like they have to take sides, for and against, you know, whether or not this church did it right, whether or not this pastor did it right, whether or not they should have fired him, whether or not he should have, you know, confessed he had a problem, whatever. And 15% of the general population would have trouble with forgiveness. 40% of adult children will have trouble with that. If you have 100 people in a church, 40 of them, so nearly half, are going to have so much problem with the kind of drama that happens from church politics that they're very likely to head out the door and never come back. Or they're going to end up being those ones who make such a stink that they end up getting condemned and sent out. Well, no, and the reason is because the church has the same problem. Most of those pastors and elders, they have the same issues. They just don't want to admit they have those issues. So they put on the suit and they look good and they say the right words, and anybody who then starts to be authentic is a threat to income or their image, and they have to be silenced. So here's our point of power. Here's what happens. Whatever happens, the church blows up, you get a divorce, and you go for marital counseling because, after all, every pastor's trained in marital counseling. No, but they do it anyway. You go and you say, my husband has beaten me, and your husband happens to be a deacon, and so you get removed from whatever your position is in the church because you're not a submitted wife. Trust me, it happens. That's the event. That's the crappy thing that happened. But that's not the end of the story. Because our point of power is our response to that event. That's where, if we react from whatever our old tapes are, then we'll sit down, be quiet, and don't make waves, or we'll blow up, or we'll do whatever our family of origin reaction is. But we can choose a different response when we have different tools in our toolbox to work with, and that's what I want to look at here. If you've been wounded, what we want to do is we want to identify the problem, and don't assume that the problem is you. Assume that maybe it's a systemic issue, maybe there's a systems issue, maybe there's a secret, maybe this, maybe that. Get more facts, get more information, do more research. When you've identified the problem, feel all the feelings that go with that, because what I see a lot of people do is say, yes, I got divorced and they let him stay in the church and they kicked me out. And
Yeah.
that felt horrible, and I felt rejected and abandoned and whatever. I have to go on and I have to be strong. And so it's, it's no point crying over spilled milk. And then we go on, and when we do that, we just set ourselves up to carry that toxic stuff with us over and over and over. So what we have to do is we have to actually go through a grieving process for every loss, and the loss of a church family is a loss. For whose fault it was, it's a loss. Feel the feelings, and then after that, you can focus on the solution. People like to go from here's the problem, here's the solution, stay in my head where it doesn't hurt, instead of doing the feeling work. The Grief Cycle by Kubler-Ross, and it's been adapted for organizations as well. But the 5 stages of grief are denial, which is the first, when it first happens, we can't believe that happened. We just can't believe it. And then anger. And then bargaining. Well, maybe if I do this, then I can keep my job. Maybe if I, go to marital counseling, then I can keep my marriage. Maybe if, whatever. That's the maybe if stage. When that doesn't work, and maybe that works, but if it doesn't work, then we get depression. And then finally, if we move through that, if we move through those stages, we'll get to acceptance, which means that it just becomes a fact of our life. The reason we can tell war stories now is because we've moved through that complete grief cycle, and now it's a fact of my life. I don't lead with my stories. I'll tell anybody any part of my life if it will serve them. There's a good reason, I'll tell it. But what happens in this red circle is that people often get stuck between anger and depression. They're either acting it out or acting it in, and they never move past to acceptance, to accepting that what happened really happened, and it really sucked and hurt, and it changed my life in these ways. And now, what am I going to do? What do I want to see happen with my life? Bottom point of depression, this is where that 40% of ACAs, the ones who have trouble forgiving or they don't trust or don't believe God's promises, this is where they exit the church and will exit their faith at the same time, because they think it's all tied together. It's all one big cluster. And so my heart is for those ones that if we can catch them before they exit, so that they understand that relationship with Jesus Christ is independent of the politics and the business of church. And you can have one without the other. You need like-minded believers, but you can find them all different ways these days. It doesn't have to be in a toxic environment. You have choices. So in order to get through the grief, this little 4-point, this is the takeaway for how do you confront a wrong? How do you tell a story? How do you go to somebody and say, this really bugs me. There's the 4 points here. Here's what happened. Just the facts. Here's how I felt about what happened. Here's how it's impacted my life today. And here's what I need from you. Now, today, we're only going to talk about the here's what happened and here's how I felt. But the rest of that story is when you go to talk to somebody that you need to get closure with or you need to have a confrontation with, you have to have that last piece, here's what I need from you, to make it whole for you so you can close that chapter and move. Safe person is somebody who will understand but be unaffected by what you have to say. The problem with trying to take your pain, if it's church pain, into your church community is other people are wounded too, sometimes by the same thing. Sometimes an anonymous person who doesn't know you or your story or your location, but who has walked that path, gives you a way to get it up and out, be heard, be validated, and then maybe get 1 or 2 ideas about what your next steps need to be, because not everybody is coming from the same place or wants to go the same direction with that. We have telephone numbers there and websites as well. I also have on the handouts, and you can download it, is a handout on the 10 earmarks of a toxic faith system. Take that with you when you go, and you can take that as a checklist. And when you're church shopping, let's say, use it like your shopping list. And when you start to see, if you see any of those things pop up, then know that that's a red flag, something you want to either ask questions about and see if you get shamed for asking questions. That would be 2 red flags and you're out. Or you'll know immediately, right? And it'll save you a little bit of time and trouble. And people have different opinions about how that sin should be handled, don't they? So the difference is the motive. It's not even the action. The difference is the motive. And is the church disciplining the person for the person's good, or so the church will look good? Are they disciplining them? Is it shaming, condemning them, and sending them out so that they can't work anywhere else? Nobody will want them. Or so that they look like the good guy and the other ones look like the bad guy? See, is it for the needs of the system, which is the church, or is it for the needs of the individual? Because if it's discipline, then that person who's being disciplined will be strengthened and spiritually grow. If it's abused, they will be weakened spiritually. If you look at the ACA statistics, if I have trouble believing God's promises and I have trouble trusting, then I have trouble receiving love too, right? Somebody talks to me about Jesus' love. I wish I could feel that, but I really can't. If what we were doing was really giving Jesus love, did the tax collector, when Jesus came by and said, "Follow me," he didn't berate him.
No.
He didn't discipline him. He was
No.
clearly, over there in left field. He said, "Follow me. Come on. Come on, I'll walk alongside you. I'll show you. We'll do this together." Because people who have trouble trusting need Jesus with skin on to tell them it's okay. Thank you. It's been a privilege to be able to address this issue at this time frame, and I just really hope that it helps somebody not be off the bench for 20 years. Good night, everybody.